"Silence, wretched servant! How dare you speak in my throne room? Silence, wretched servant! How dare you speak in my throne room?" King Edward III of Windsor's voice exploded through the grand hall of Buckingham Palace like thunder before a storm. His words cut through the air with the precision of a blade, and instantly the courtiers erupted in cruel laughter. The echo of that mockery bounced off the crystal chandeliers, off the gilded walls, off the marble floor that gleamed beneath the silk gowns and polished shoes of England's most powerful elite. There, among silver trays and discreet shadows, stood Rose Sullivan, the new scullery maid, invisible to this world of privilege. Her simple grey dress and white apron trembled along with her hands as the crowd pointed at her as if she were cheap entertainment. Everyone expected to see her retreat, flee, break down in tears. But what they didn't know was that this Irish peasant carried a secret that would shake the very foundations of the throne. The golden light from 1,000 candles danced across the hall like liquid honey. Each flame seemed to bow reverently before the guests in their impeccable tailcoats and silk dresses, who laughed with crystal glasses of champagne in hand. The brilliance of the chandeliers bathed the grand hall like suspended suns from the ceiling, multiplying luxury in every corner. The air itself tasted of wealth, imported wine, French perfume, the subtle scent of power that only the privileged know. Have you ever walked into a room where you knew you didn't belong? Where every eye judged you before you even spoke? That's what Rose felt in that moment, yet she didn't look away. In the center of this splendor, he dominated the space. King Edward III of Windsor, monarch of England, walked with the certainty of someone who had never known the word no. His royal purple robe trimmed with ermine, the golden crown resting on his silver hair, and that sideways smile of self-satisfaction made him the inevitable center of all gazes. He moved as if the entire hall had been designed to frame his figure. Power without dignity, you see, is just noise dressed in expensive cloth. At one side, among trays of glasses and discreet movements, stood she, Rose Sullivan, with her grey dress and white apron, her auburn hair pulled back in a low bun that revealed the delicacy of her Irish features. She wore no jewels, no artifice, only the learned silence of someone who had grown up being invisible amid the abundance of others. Her green eyes, however, held something that luxury could never buy, a quiet dignity that burned like an ember beneath ash. In her pocket, folded carefully against her heart, she carried a worn photograph of her father, Patrick Sullivan. She touched it now, drawing strength from that simple gesture, as if his spirit could reach across the years to steady her trembling hands. The guests murmured with curiosity. Some laughed, recalling the mockery the king had just pronounced. Others waited intrigued, as if sensing this could become an even juicier spectacle. The echo of laughter continued floating in the air, but beneath that festive surface one could sense the collective expectation of seeing how the Irish peasant would react. What none of them could have guessed was that every detail she was about to reveal had been burned into her memory for 3 decades. King Edward struck his glass lightly with his royal scepter, and the tinkling of crystal cut through the murmur like a knife. "Lords and ladies," he proclaimed, with a grave voice and calculated theatricality, "I believe this evening deserves an experiment." The hall responded with a wave of laughter and applause. He advanced toward where Rose stood, holding the silver tray with both hands. His steps resonated on the marble like a martial beat. Every gaze followed her, every breath seemed to wait for the instant when she would break. When he stood before her, King Edward pointed at the ancient portrait above the grand fireplace. 2 golden-haired boys, one bearing a crescent scar near his temple. His confident smile seemed to say he already knew the ending. But did he? Rose felt blood rush to her cheeks, a heat that suffocated her and sustained her at the same time. The tray trembled, but her eyes did not turn away from his. In that gaze there was something more, a silent strength that none of those present could read. Her fingers unconsciously traced the edge of the photograph in her pocket, that sacred talisman of her father's memory. "This Irish peasant," the king announced to his court, his voice dripping with disdain, "claims to recognize my younger brother, Prince William, in this portrait. She dares to suggest that the boy who disappeared 30 years ago on the road to Dover, presumed dead by all England, lived with her at some orphanage." The word rolled off his tongue like an insult. The laughter exploded again, louder this time, crueler. A duchess in emerald silk covered her mouth with a gloved hand. How absurd! A lord in military uniform shook his head. "The delusions of the lower class know no bounds." Another voice rang out, "Send her back to scrubbing floors." The jeers came in waves, each one meant to drown her spirit. But Rose's fingers tightened around the photograph in her pocket. She heard her father's voice, clear as day. "Never fear the truth, my dear girl. Even when the world laughs, truth stands taller than any throne." But Rose did not retreat. Her fingers gripped the tray with determination, and her lips closed with a mute resolve. The entire hall hung suspended in expectant silence, as if even the musicians awaited her reaction. The guests settled into their seats, eager to witness the humiliation they considered certain. Perhaps you've been in a moment like this, when everyone expects you to fail, to break, to disappear. What would you do? What no one imagined was that tonight, in this very hall, an ancient secret was about to come to light, and nothing would ever be the same again. If this story has moved you so far, let us know in the comments what city and country you're watching from, and leave your like so we can keep sharing stories that touch hearts around the world. We're building a community that believes dignity matters more than wealth. The murmur of the hall had become a restless rumble. No one spoke loudly, but the glances, the gestures, the fans snapping shut with a nervous click were enough to fill the air with expectation. King Edward III of Windsor savoured that silence, like an actor relishing his own triumphant entrance. "What's wrong?" he asked with feigned innocence, turning on himself. "Don't you wish to see a spectacle?" The laughter returned, but more contained, as if the audience first needed their master's signal to surrender to the feast. "All of us have witnessed cruelty disguised as entertainment, haven't we?" Edward raised his hand, examining it with exaggeration, then held it before him as if afraid to soil himself with something dirty. "This is not a simple matter of royal lineage, ladies and gentlemen." His tone was solemn, loaded with irony. "Here rests the honor of the crown, the memory of my beloved brother. But I doubt very much that our little Irish maid even knows what proof means." The blow was direct. A guest let out a nasal laugh that dragged several others along. The ladies tilted their heads as if observing a vulgar comedy from an opera box. The same mouths that dined on her service now mocked her existence. King Edward extended his hand toward Rose, approaching and withdrawing it suddenly, as if playing to provoke a defenseless animal. "Come now, try it." He lowered his voice to a whisper that only those closest could hear. "Prove your madness, or return to scrubbing floors, which is the only thing you're made for." Rose's stomach contracted, but her feet remained firm. She felt the weight of all those gazes that stripped her with contempt, and a wave of heat rose from her hands to her face. She pressed her lips together and breathed deeply. In that moment, she touched the photograph again, and her father's words echoed. "Never fear the truth, my dear girl." The court musicians, who until then had remained in a murmur of tuning, fell completely silent. The conductor, a man with silver hair, lowered his baton with an intrigued gesture. The notes, still floating in the air, died like extinguished fireflies. "Silence!" exclaimed King Edward suddenly, raising his scepter as if it were a banner. "I want not a single note until this young woman attempts to demonstrate the impossible." The order fell with brutal weight. The musicians obeyed without protest, and the entire hall sank into a sound vacuum that amplified Rose's every breath. Someone from the back shouted, "She won't last a second." Another voice added mockingly, "Bring a mop, it'll be more useful in her hands." "Let's see her dignity now," a third voice jeered. The echo of those jeers was like a whiplash, cutting deep into the air. But in the deepest part of her memory, Rose heard another voice, soft and firm. "Never fear the truth, my dear girl. Even when the world laughs, truth stands taller than any throne." It was her father, Patrick Sullivan, bending over her in those afternoons of childhood at St. Catherine's Orphanage, his hands worn from labour, gentle on her shoulders, his eyes full of a dignity that poverty could never steal. That memory gave her a spark of courage amid the storm. King Edward tilted his head, studying her like a hunter measuring his prey's resistance. "Listen, girl, I give you this opportunity because I know you will fail." He raised his hand barely a few centimeters closer. "And when you do, everyone here will know what you are. Nothing." The silence grew heavier. Rose could hear her own heart pounding in her chest like a war drum. But then something shifted inside her. The weight of the photograph in her pocket felt lighter now, as if her father's spirit was lifting the burden. What she was about to say would change everything, forever. Then, with a calm that froze everyone, she spoke. Her voice was quiet at first, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Your Majesty," she began, her Irish accent colouring each word, "I do not speak from madness, I speak from memory." The hall held its breath. Edward's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. Rose took a small step forward, her dignity unshaken. "The boy I knew at St. Catherine's Orphanage," she continued, her voice growing stronger, "had a crescent-shaped scar near his left temple. He got it when he fell from an oak tree, trying to reach a bird's nest." A few courtiers exchanged uncertain glances. The king's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, a ghost of recognition, a shadow of hope he'd buried long ago. "Many boys have scars," he said dismissively, though his voice had lost some of its edge. "Coincidence proves nothing." Rose nodded slowly, her hands steady now. "You're right, Your Majesty, a scar alone proves little." She paused, letting the tension build. Could she really know more? But this boy also had a birthmark, shaped like a tiny crown, just beneath his collar, on his right shoulder. The murmur in the hall intensified. Several nobles leaned forward in their seats, their mockery fading into curiosity. King Edward's hand moved involuntarily to his own neck, as if to check something, then dropped quickly to his side. The gesture was small, but Rose saw it. She saw the crack in his armor, and she pressed forward. "The boy was obsessed with drawing," Rose continued, her voice steady now, carrying to every corner of the vast hall. "He would sketch the same building over and over, a palace with blue stained-glass windows and a golden harp in the great hall. He said he couldn't remember where he'd seen it, but he knew it was real. He knew it was home." A woman near the front gasped softly. The blue-stained glass, the golden harp. These were details of the royal music room, a chamber rarely seen by anyone outside the immediate royal family. Details that would never appear in any public record, any painting, any book accessible to a common orphan girl. How could she possibly know? The atmosphere in the hall shifted like a tide turning. The laughter had died completely, replaced by an electric silence that hummed with possibility. King Edward's face had drained of all colour. His hands, which had been so steady in their mockery, now trembled slightly. "How?" he whispered, then caught himself clearing his throat. "How do you know these things?" His voice cracked on the last word, revealing the man beneath the crown. Rose's eyes filled with tears, but she held his gaze, refusing to look away. "Because William never forgot, Your Majesty. Even after 30 years in that orphanage, even after the bandits left him for dead on the road to Dover, even after he lost everything, he never forgot who he was." She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried through the vast hall. And he never forgot the lullaby. The word hung in the air like a benediction, like a key turning in a lock that had been sealed for 3 decades. "What lullaby?" the king demanded, but his voice cracked. The entire court could hear it. The first fracture in his armor of arrogance, the first glimpse of the brother beneath the monarch. His eyes glistened with unshed tears. Rose closed her eyes, and when she spoke again, it was in the voice of memory, soft and pure, the voice of a child singing in the darkness of an orphanage dormitory. "Hush now, young prince. The stars watch over thee, the moon guards your dreams across land and sea. Your brother stands watch through the dark of night until morning returns with the golden light." The king staggered backward as if struck by an invisible hand. His hand gripped the edge of a nearby table for support, his knuckles white with the force of his grip. "No," he breathed, the word barely audible. "No one. No one knows that song. Only William and I—" His voice broke entirely, crumbling like ancient stone. The lullaby their mother had sung to them both, before she died when they were children. The lullaby he had sung to William on the night before his brother disappeared. A song never written down, never shared, never known to anyone but the 2 brothers. It was their secret, their sacred bond, and now this Irish girl sang it as if she'd heard it 1,000 times. The hall erupted in chaos. Nobles jumped to their feet. Ladies began crying, their gloved hands pressed to their mouths. The mockery had transformed into stunned disbelief. "It can't be!" someone shouted. "Prince William died decades ago." But King Edward was no longer listening. He was staring at Rose with an expression that had shifted from cruelty to desperate, aching hope. The same eyes that had dismissed her now looked at her as if she held the key to heaven itself. "Where is he?" the king demanded, his voice raw with 3 decades of grief pouring out at once. "Where is my brother?" He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, grabbing Rose's shoulders, not with violence, but with the desperate grip of a drowning man reaching for salvation. The crowd gasped, but no one intervened. This was beyond protocol now. This was a brother's love, stripped of all pretense. Rose's tears fell freely now, carving clean paths down her cheeks. "The last I saw him, Your Majesty, he was in London, working as a street musician near Westminster Bridge. He plays the violin, the only possession he managed to keep from his childhood." Her voice softened. "He plays those haunting melodies, the ones you sang together. He's been waiting, Your Majesty. All these years, he's been waiting for someone to remember, for someone to bring him home." For a long moment, King Edward could not speak. The arrogant tyrant had vanished, replaced by a broken man who had lost his only brother 3 decades ago and just learned he might still be alive. Can you imagine that moment? The hope mixed with terror, the joy tangled with fear that it might all be a cruel illusion. "Take me to him," he whispered, then louder, a command that echoed through the hall but carried none of his earlier cruelty. "Take me to him now." The transformation in the king was like watching ice melt under sudden sun. All the pride, all the mockery, all the cruelty, it crumbled in an instant, leaving behind only a brother who had mourned for 30 years. He turned to his guards, his crown slightly askew now, his robe disheveled. "Prepare my carriage immediately. Clear the streets to Westminster Bridge." Then he looked back at Rose, and this time his eyes held no contempt, only gratitude mixed with desperate fear. "Please," he said, and the word, so foreign to his lips, silenced the hall completely. "Please, Rose Sullivan, lead me to my brother." Have you ever seen someone's entire world change in a single moment? That's what happened in that hall. The courtiers who had laughed now wept openly. The nobles who had mocked now stood in awed silence. And Rose stood tall, her dignity intact, her father's voice still echoing in her heart. "Never fear the truth, my dear girl." She had spoken truth to power, and power had knelt before it. If this revelation has touched your heart, share this story with someone who needs to remember that truth always finds a way. Comment below if you've ever had to speak up when everyone told you to stay silent. Your courage matters. We're all part of this journey together. As the court scrambled into action, Rose noticed the ancient portrait above the fireplace. The two golden-haired boys seemed to gaze down at her, their painted eyes alive with hope. She had spoken the truth when the world demanded silence. And now that truth was about to reunite what fate had torn apart. The rain had started falling by the time the royal carriage clattered through London's narrow streets. King Edward sat across from Rose, his crown abandoned on the seat beside him, his royal composure completely shattered. "Tell me about him," he pleaded, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Tell me everything." Rose watched the city lights blur past the rain-streaked windows. "He was kind, Your Majesty. Even with nothing, he shared what little he had. The other children at St. Catherine's loved him. He protected the smaller ones, taught them songs, drew pictures to make them smile." She paused, remembering those days. He never complained about his circumstances. "But sometimes, late at night, I would hear him crying. He'd clutch this old silver medallion, the only thing the bandits hadn't stolen, and whisper names. 'Your name, Your Majesty.' He never forgot you." A sob escaped the king's throat, a sound so raw, so human, that Rose barely recognized him as the same man who had mocked her an hour before. "I searched for him," Edward whispered, tears streaming down his face. "For years I searched. The entire kingdom searched. We found the burned carriage, the bodies of his guards, but never William. Everyone said he must have died. Everyone said I should give up hope. But I never stopped seeing him in my dreams, never stopped hearing that lullaby in the quiet moments." He looked at Rose with red-rimmed eyes. "You've given me back more than my brother. You've given me back hope itself." The carriage slowed as they approached Westminster Bridge. Through the rain, Rose could see a figure huddled beneath the stone arches, a violin case open before him. Even from a distance, even through the downpour, they could hear the music, a melody so hauntingly beautiful that people had stopped despite the rain, drawn to its magic like moths to flame. That music carried the weight of 30 years of loneliness, 30 years of remembering a home that seemed lost forever. King Edward was out of the carriage before it fully stopped, splashing through puddles, his royal robes dragging through mud. He didn't care. Nothing mattered except the figure beneath the bridge. "William!" he called out, his voice breaking with hope and fear. The musician stopped playing. Slowly he looked up, and in the flickering lamplight Rose saw his face clearly, for the first time in years. Time had weathered it, poverty had marked it, but the resemblance to the portrait was unmistakable. The same golden hair, now streaked with grey, the same blue eyes, and there, just visible above his worn collar, the edge of a birthmark shaped like a tiny crown. "Edward?" William whispered, his violin lowering with shaking hands. Is that really you?" The brothers stared at each other across the rain-soaked cobblestones. 30 years of separation, of grief, of lost time hung between them like a chasm. And then, with a cry that seemed torn from the depths of his soul, King Edward rushed forward and caught his brother in a desperate embrace. The violin clattered forgotten to the ground as they collapsed together onto the wet stones, clinging to each other as if afraid the other would vanish. They wept openly. The king, the most powerful man in England, and the street musician, their tears mixing with the rain. "I'm sorry," Edward sobbed, his face buried in his brother's shoulder. "I'm so sorry. I should have protected you. I should have found you. I'm so sorry." William's arms tightened around his brother. "You're here now," he whispered back, his own tears flowing freely. "You found me. After all these years, you found me." The crowd that had gathered stood in respectful silence, witnesses to a miracle of love and memory. Rose kept her distance, giving the brothers their moment. She watched as years of pain, years of separation, years of loneliness finally began to heal. Her father's photograph pressed against her heart, and she heard his voice one last time. "Never fear the truth, my dear girl. Even when the world laughs, truth stands taller than any throne." She had honored his memory. She had spoken truth to power, and power had bowed before dignity. When the brothers finally pulled apart, Edward cupped William's face in his hands, studying every line, every scar, as if trying to memorize him all over again. "Come home," he said, his voice breaking. "Please, William, come home." William looked past his brother to where Rose stood, sheltering beneath an umbrella. His eyes asked a silent question, and she nodded, smiling through her own tears. He turned back to Edward. "Yes," William said, his voice steady now. "I'll come home." The journey back to Buckingham Palace was unlike any procession in England's history. The king rode not in splendour, but in silence, his brother beside him, their hands clasped together as if they were children again, afraid to let go. Rose sat across from them, momentarily forgotten, but she didn't mind. She had done what her father always taught her, spoken truth when it mattered most. The photograph in her pocket felt warm now, as if her father's spirit was finally at peace. When they arrived at the palace, the entire court had gathered in the grand hall, word of the miracle having spread like wildfire. The same nobles who had mocked Rose now stood in awed silence as King Edward entered, not with his usual pride, but supporting his brother, who stumbled on legs weak from years of poverty and hardship. "Lords and ladies," the king announced, his voice ringing clear despite the tears on his cheeks, "I present to you Prince William of Windsor, my brother, alive and returned to us." The hall exploded in cheers and applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the palace. The hall exploded in cheers and applause, but Edward raised his hand for silence. When the hall quieted, he turned to Rose, who had tried to slip away to the servants' quarters. "Miss Sullivan!" he called out, his voice carrying across the vast space. "Rose Sullivan of Ireland, come forward." Trembling, Rose approached. She didn't know what to expect. Instead, King Edward took her hand and raised it high. The same hand that had gripped a silver tray in shame now held the king's in honor. "This woman," he proclaimed to the assembled court, his voice thick with emotion, "possessed more courage in her little finger than all of us combined. While we laughed, she spoke truth. While we mocked, she offered hope. While I stood in arrogant pride, she stood in humble dignity. Today, she has given me back the most precious thing I ever lost, my brother. Therefore I decree that Rose Sullivan is hereby elevated to Lady Rose Sullivan of Windsor, with all rights, lands, and honours befitting nobility." The court gasped. A scullery maid, elevated to the peerage. It was unprecedented, unthinkable, and absolutely right. "Furthermore," Edward continued, his voice growing stronger, "Lady Rose and I shall establish the Royal Foundation for Lost Children in honor of the orphans who cared for my brother when he had nothing. Never again shall this kingdom turn its back on those who have lost their way. Never again shall pride blind us to truth. Never again shall dignity be determined by wealth rather than character." The applause this time was thunderous, genuine, transforming the hall from a place of mockery into a cathedral of redemption. Rose could barely stand, her legs weak with shock, but William stepped forward and took her other hand, squeezing it gently. "Thank you," he whispered, his eyes glistening. "Thank you for remembering. Thank you for caring enough to speak. Thank you for honoring dignity when the world offered only cruelty." That night, as celebrations echoed through the palace, Rose stood before the portrait of the two golden-haired boys. Someone had placed candles around it, transforming it from a memorial of loss into a testament of hope fulfilled. King Edward joined her there, his brother by his side at last, exactly where he belonged. "I was cruel to you," Edward said quietly, his eyes fixed on the portrait. I let my position make me arrogant. I let my power make me heartless. You showed me what I had become, and in doing so you saved not just my brother but my soul." Rose looked at him, this man who had mocked her, humiliated her, threatened her, and she saw not a king, but a human being who had suffered, who had learned, who had changed. "Your Majesty," she said softly, touching the photograph in her pocket one last time. "Sometimes we need to lose everything to remember what truly matters. My father taught me that dignity is not about position or wealth. It's about how we treat others when no one is watching. It's about speaking truth, even when silence would be easier." The weeks that followed transformed more than just Rose's life. They transformed an entire kingdom's understanding of what truly mattered. The Royal Foundation for Lost Children opened its doors in a restored manor just outside London, with William himself serving as its patron. The building had once been abandoned, its windows dark, its gardens overgrown, a perfect metaphor for the forgotten children it would now serve. William had declined his brother's offers of royal titles and wealth, asking only for the chance to help children, as St. Catherine's Orphanage had once helped him. "I don't need a crown," he told Edward during one of their long conversations, his hands still calloused from years of labor. "I need purpose. These children, they're living the life I lived. They wake up every morning wondering if anyone remembers them, if anyone cares. They deserve someone who understands that pain, someone who won't forget them the way the world forgot me." His voice broke slightly. "I was one of the lucky ones." Rose remembered, but how many children are out there right now, waiting for someone to speak their truth? The foundation provided education, shelter, music lessons, art supplies, and most importantly, hope to London's forgotten children. Every child who entered received not just a bed and meals, but a promise. You are not forgotten. You matter. Your story is important. Your dignity is sacred. Rose worked alongside William, her natural compassion and understanding making her invaluable to the children who came through their doors. She remembered what it was like to feel invisible, to be dismissed, to have your truth ignored. So she listened when the children spoke. She believed them when others doubted. She held them when they cried for families they'd lost or never known. The children called her Lady Rose, but she insisted they simply call her Rose, a reminder that titles mattered far less than hearts. She taught them what her father had taught her, that dignity is not inherited or purchased but chosen, that truth is more powerful than any crown, that every voice deserves to be heard, every story deserves to be told, every soul deserves to be remembered. King Edward, true to his transformation, became the Foundation's most ardent supporter. He visited regularly, often arriving unannounced to play games with the children or listen to their stories. The arrogant tyrant had become a patron of the overlooked, and England noticed. The court that had once celebrated cruelty now celebrated compassion. The nobles who had mocked the poor now competed to fund charitable works. It was as if the kingdom itself had been holding its breath for 30 years, waiting for this moment of redemption, waiting for someone to prove that dignity triumphs over arrogance, that truth outlasts lies, that love conquers even the longest separation. One evening, as autumn painted the palace gardens in gold and crimson, Rose stood on a balcony overlooking the Thames. She held a letter from her family in Ireland. They could barely believe her elevation to nobility, the establishment of the foundation, the transformation of a king. "Remarkable, isn't it?" William's voice came from behind her. He joined her at the railing, his violin tucked under his arm as always. How one moment of courage can change everything. Rose smiled, her fingers tracing the edge of her father's photograph, which she still carried always. "I wasn't trying to change anything. I couldn't let them believe you were gone when I knew you were alive. My father always said that silence in the face of injustice is injustice itself." William nodded thoughtfully. Your father was a wise man. I wish I could thank him." "He would say the same about you," Rose replied. "He always told me that nobility isn't about titles or wealth. It's about how we treat those who can do nothing for us in return. It's about remembering those the world has forgotten." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sun set over London. "Do you ever regret speaking up?" William asked quietly. "Even for a moment, when the king threatened you, when the court laughed at you, did you regret it?" Rose considered the question carefully, her hand resting over her heart where the photograph lay. "No," she said finally. "I was terrified, yes. I thought I might lose everything, even my life, but some truths are bigger than our fears. Some moments demand that we speak, regardless of the cost." My father's voice kept echoing, "Never fear the truth, my dear girl," and I realized that if I stayed silent, I would dishonor his memory and your existence. That would have been the real tragedy. "That's what makes you remarkable," William said softly. "Not your elevation to nobility, not your work with the foundation, but your willingness to speak truth to power when everyone else stayed silent. You showed us all what real courage looks like. It's not the absence of fear, it's speaking truth despite the fear." Below them, children from the foundation played in the palace gardens, a sight that would have been unthinkable just months before. Their laughter drifted up on the evening breeze, a sound of pure joy that needed no translation, no explanation. It simply was, and it was enough. King Edward appeared in the doorway, watching his brother and Rose with an expression of profound peace. He had spent 30 years bearing the weight of loss, of guilt, of wondering. And now, because one Irish girl had refused to be silenced, he had his brother back. The portrait that hung in the Grand Hall was no longer a memorial. It was a promise fulfilled. As darkness fell over London, the palace glowed with warmth and light. Inside, 3 people who had each known loss, each faced darkness, each chosen hope over despair, stood together. Not as king, prince, and peasant, but as 3 souls who understood that the most precious things in life cannot be bought, cannot be commanded, and cannot be silenced. The story of Rose Sullivan and the Lost Prince became legend in England. Ballads were sung about it in taverns and whispered as bedtime stories to children. But those who had lived it knew that the real story was simpler and more profound than any legend could capture. It was a story about a girl who remembered when others forgot, about a brother who never gave up hope, about a king who learned that power without compassion is just cruelty dressed in silk. It was a story about truth, how it burns like fire, how it cannot be buried no matter how much earth you pile upon it, how it always, always finds a way to the surface. And in the end, it was a story about family. Not the family we're born into, but the family we choose, the family we create through loyalty, through sacrifice, through the simple act of caring about someone else's pain. Rose had found William not through royal decree or military might, but through the power of memory and the courage to speak. William had survived 30 years of hardship not through strength alone, but through holding on to the memory of love, the songs his brother sang, the palace he once called home, the belief that somewhere someone still remembered him. And King Edward had found redemption not through wealth or power, but through humility, the willingness to admit he had been wrong, to let go of his pride, to embrace change. The portrait in the Grand Hall watched over them all, its painted eyes now seeming to smile. What had begun as a symbol of loss had become a symbol of hope. What had started with mockery had ended with reunion. What had been torn apart by violence had been healed by truth. As the candles burned low and the palace settled into peaceful sleep, one truth remained clear. Dignity always triumphs over arrogance. Truth always outlasts lies. And love, the kind of love that refuses to forget, that refuses to give up hope, that refuses to stay silent in the face of injustice, That kind of love can topple thrones and reunite kingdoms. Rose Sullivan, once invisible, had changed the course of history. Not through force, not through wealth, not through power, but through something far more precious, the courage to speak truth when the world demanded silence. Let this story remind us all that we each possess that same power. When we see injustice, we can speak. When we witness suffering, we can act. When others are forgotten, we can remember. We are all capable of extraordinary courage. We are all capable of changing lives. We are all capable of bringing lost souls home. The question is not whether we have the power. The question is whether we have the courage to use it. As Rose proved on that rain-soaked night in London, sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone else overlooks. Sometimes the greatest act of nobility comes from the least likely source. And sometimes, just sometimes, the truth spoken by a scullery maid can do what armies and wealth and power never could. It can mend a broken heart and heal a fractured kingdom. If this story has moved you, if it's reminded you of the power we all hold to make a difference, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment telling us what this story meant to you. And before you go, take a moment to think about this. Whose truth needs to be heard in your life? Who have you overlooked? Who needs someone to speak for them when they cannot speak for themselves? The Royal Foundation for Lost Children stands as a monument to one woman's courage and one king's transformation. But the real foundation, the one that matters most, is the one we build in our own hearts. The foundation of compassion, of dignity, of refusing to let others be forgotten. Tonight, somewhere in London, children who once had nothing sleep in warm beds because Rose spoke up. Somewhere in the palace, two brothers who lost each other have found their way home. And somewhere in Ireland, Patrick Sullivan's legacy lives on through his daughter, a legacy not of wealth or position, but of something far more valuable, the understanding that truth and dignity are worth any cost, any sacrifice, any risk. That is the gift Rose gave to England. That is the gift she gives to us all. The reminder that we are not powerless, we are not voiceless, we are not insignificant. We are bearers of truth, keepers of hope, and protectors of the forgotten. And when we choose to speak, when we choose to act, when we choose to care, we can change the world. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you believe in the power of truth and the strength of dignity, share this story. Let it remind others that courage comes in all forms, from all places, from all people. Subscribe to never miss stories that touch the heart and challenge the soul. Leave your like if you believe that dignity matters more than wealth, that truth is more powerful than any crown, and that every voice deserves to be heard. And remember, you carry within you the same power that Rose carried that night. The power to speak truth, the power to reunite the lost, the power to change everything. The only question is, will you use it?